Welcome once again to Fireside Story. Today, we tell you the story of a decision, one that cost a kingdom and redefined the course of history. On July 19th, 1195, everything was ready for the confrontation. Alfonso VIII of Castile found himself facing the immense army of the Almohad Caliphate. He knew that his cousins had failed him, but one hope still remained. The reinforcements from the King of Navarre were on their way. So why didn't he wait? What drove the king to risk it all in a battle alone against the most powerful army of his time? This is the tale of a miscalculation, an act of pride that almost wiped Castile off the map. We begin our story now. To understand the enemy of Alfonso VIII, it is not enough to see his army. One must understand the idea that forged it. The Almohads, or those who proclaim unity, were born from a radical idea in the Atlas Mountains. Their founder, Ibn Tumart, preached a return to a pure and uncompromising Islam. For them, the jihad was not only a war against the Christians, but also against the Muslims they considered corrupt. This religious fundamentalism gave them a cohesion and a purpose that their enemies did not have. It was the second Caliph, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, who turned that fervor into a stable empire. He was the father of Yaqub al-Mansur, the Caliph, who would fight at Alarcos. Abu Yaqub Yusuf consolidated Almohad power from Morocco to Libya and crossed to the peninsula to subjugate the last Taifa kingdoms. Under his rule, Al-Andalus was forcibly unified, halting the Christian advance that had culminated in the conquest of important cities. The structure of the empire was both military and religious. The Caliph was the spiritual leader and the commander-in-chief. His army combined the fanatical loyalty of the Berber tribes, who formed the core of his forces, with the experience of the Andalusi soldiers and the ferocity of the volunteers who had come for the Holy War. Their power resided not only in numbers, but in the belief that they were fighting for the cause of God. Therefore, in 1095, the Almohads were not mere invaders. They were the masters of a centralized and formidable state, with capitals in Marrakech and Seville. They controlled the rich valleys of the Guadalquivir and the strategic cities of the south. They were a superpower that threatened to undo a century of Reconquista. The crown that Alfonso VIII received at 3 years old was more a poison than a prize. His father died unexpectedly, and Castile was plunged into a bloody civil war. The great noble families, the Laras and the Castros, fought mercilessly to control the boy king, who was little more than a pawn in their power game. For years, the young Alfonso was hidden, kidnapped, and threatened. Surviving that childhood did not make him prudent. It made him implacable. He learned a fundamental lesson. He could only trust himself. When he finally came of age and took up the sword, he acted with a speed and determination that surprised everyone. He subdued the rebellious nobles and pacified the kingdom with an iron fist, but he needed a great victory to cement his authority, one that would demonstrate that he was the true leader of the Reconquista. He found it in 1177, with the epic conquest of the fortified city of Cuenca. After a siege of months, the city fell. It was an immense strategic victory, but above all, it was a declaration of intentions. From that moment on, Alfonso VIII's vision grew larger. He was not content with being the King of Castile. He saw himself as the natural leader of all the Christian kingdoms of the peninsula. He considered himself the Emperor of the Spains, in all but name. This excessive ambition put him in direct conflict with his neighbors, especially with his cousin, the King of Leon, who had no intention of submitting to him. Therefore, the man who rode towards Alarcos was not a simple king. He was a survivor forged in chaos, a conqueror proven in battle, and a leader with an unshakable faith in his own destiny. He believed that God had chosen him, and that conviction made him brave, but also dangerously proud. The man who earned the title of Al-Mansur, the Victorious, was much more than a simple warrior. Abu Yusuf Yaqub was a complex leader, as devout in the mosque as he was astute on the battlefield. He inherited a vast and often unstable empire. He spent the first years of his reign consolidating it, crushing rebellions from Tripoli to the Atlantic. These campaigns hardened him as a strategist and earned him the respect of his army. But Al-Mansur was not just a man of war. He was also a great builder and a patron of culture. Under his rule, jewels of Islamic architecture were erected. One example is the Qutubiyya minaret in Marrakesh. Another is what we know today as the Giralda of Seville. He was a cultured man who ruled an empire at its peak. However, at the heart of his power beat the Almohad religious fervor. The constant incursions of Alfonso VIII into Al-Andalus were not just a military problem. The humiliating sack at the gates of Seville was an insult to his faith. It was an affront to his authority as Caliph, and the response had to be exemplary. Therefore, his decision to cross the strait was not a simple reprisal. It was the solemn proclamation of a jihad. Al-Mansur was not coming to conquer territory. His objective was to punish a king he considered an infidel and arrogant. He saw in this campaign the opportunity to reaffirm his leadership in the Islamic world. He sought to earn, before his people and his God, the title of the Victorious. His reputation and his legacy were at stake. The wars in the Reconquista were not always continuous. Often, they were interrupted by truces, pragmatic agreements, so that both sides could recover. In 1190, Alfonso VIII and the Almohad Caliph had signed one of these pacts. But on the frontier, peace was a relative concept. The military orders, such as the Knights of Calatrava, did not feel bound by the king's diplomacy. For these warrior monks, the fight against the infidel was a divine mission that allowed for no pauses. The man who lit the fuse of the conflict did not wear armor, but a mitre. Martín López de Pisuerga, the powerful Archbishop of Toledo, was a staunch defender of total war. He considered the truce an act of cowardice and used his immense influence to encourage the knights of the frontier to attack Al-Andalus. These were not simple raids to steal cattle. They were large-scale, perfectly organized attacks. The point of no return came in the summer of 1194. A large cavalry force, led by the Archbishop in person, entered deep into Almohad territory, sowing terror. They did not limit themselves to the frontier. They reached as far as the plains of Cordoba and Seville, the two great Andalusian capitals, sacking the outskirts and challenging the Caliph in his own home. The provocation was deliberate, calculated, and spectacularly reckless. For Yaqub al-Mansur, this incursion was a gift from heaven. The offense was so grave that no one, neither in his court nor outside of it, could accuse him of breaking the peace. He had the moral and religious justification he needed. From Marrakesh, the response was immediate and devastating. The truce was dead. The Caliph solemnly proclaimed jihad against the King of Castile, and the war machine of the largest empire in North Africa began to move. Caliph al-Mansur's call to jihad set a terrifying military machine in motion. For months, contingents from all over the empire gathered on the plains of Morocco, near the coast. The chronicles of the time speak of figures that seem exaggerated to us today, but there is no doubt that it was one of the largest armies the medieval Mediterranean had ever seen. The hardcore was formed by the Berber tribes of the Atlas. They were ascetic warriors who had been the origin of the Almohad movement. Marching alongside them was the fearsome Black Guard, an elite unit of sub-Saharan soldiers. They were famous for their stature, their discipline, and their unwavering loyalty to the Caliph. Joining them were contingents of Arab light cavalry and thousands of volunteers. In the spring of 1195, This immense host appeared before the Strait of Gibraltar. The logistical operation to cross it was a feat. For days, a fleet of ships endlessly transported thousands of men, horses, and equipment to Tarifa. On June the 1st, the Caliph himself disembarked on the peninsula. The news spread like wildfire through the Christian kingdoms. Once in Al-Andalus, the army did not launch a direct attack. Its advance was slow and deliberate. First, they marched to Seville, where they remained for weeks to reorganize and add the Andalusian troops to their ranks. In the shadow of the Giralda, Al-Mansur prepared the next step of his plan. The invasion was not an impulse, it was a methodical execution. As the Almohad army advanced, the question in the Christian courts was not how to stop it, but who would lead the fight, and therein lay their greatest weakness. Alfonso VIII of Castile saw himself as the supreme leader of Hispanic Christendom, but his neighbors did not agree. The main source of tension was with the Kingdom of Leon, ruled by his first cousin, Alfonso IX. More than family, they were bitter rivals. The dispute between Castile and Leon was old and bitter. It centered on the control of the Tierra de Campo, a rich strip of territory that both kingdoms claimed. For years, they had waged small wars and signed truces that never lasted. The distrust was mutual and deep. Alfonso IX saw the Castilian as an arrogant expansionist. For his part, the Castilian considered his cousin an obstacle to the unity and glory of his project. The relationship with the Kingdom of Navarre was not much better. Its king, Sancho VII the Strong, was a pragmatic and astute monarch who had also had his clashes with Castile over border issues. Although the Almohad threat was real, Sancho VII saw an opportunity in the crisis. A weakening of Castile could, in the long run, benefit his own kingdom, wedged between much more powerful neighbors. Therefore, when news of the invasion arrived, the reaction was not one of panic, but of political calculation. Previous attempts to create a pan-Christian alliance had failed because of these same jealousies and rivalries. The idea of uniting under the banner of Castile was unacceptable to the Leonese and Navarrese. Each king looked out for his own interests. The concept of a united front was a fantasy. The reality was a tangle of family grudges and political ambitions that was about to have catastrophic consequences. Aware that he was alone, Alfonso VIII was not daunted. On the contrary, his pride seemed to grow. He issued the call to arms throughout the kingdom, and the response from his Castilian vassals was massive. Nobles, bishops, and the militias of the cities came to Toledo, the rallying point. Once the host was assembled, the king gave the order that everyone was waiting for, to march south, directly to meet the enemy. The route took them through the arid lands of La Mancha. The objective was the fortress of Alarcos, near present-day Ciudad Real. It was not a place chosen at random. Alarcos was a strategic enclave of the First Order, a newly built castle that dominated the pass to the Guadalquivir Valley. Whoever controlled Alarcos controlled the gateway to Al-Andalus. Alfonso VIII's intention was clear: to confront the Caliph in the heart of the frontier. The army that marched under the July sun was an impressive force, although inferior in number to the Almohads. Its main weapon was the heavy cavalry. Hundreds of nobles and knights covered from head to toe in chainmail, mounted on great warhorses. Their frontal charge was legendary, capable of breaking any infantry formation. They represented the military elite of Christian Europe. Alongside them were the city militias, a solid infantry armed with spears and shields, and a considerable number of crossbowmen. But the true professional core of the army was the military orders. The Knights of Santiago and, above all, those of Calatrava, whose master led the vanguard. They were the most experienced, disciplined, and motivated soldiers, the spearhead of the King of Castile. This is where the story takes a tragic turn. Despite his initial resentment, Alfonso IX of Leon finally reconsidered. Faced with the scale of the Almohad invasion, he understood that a total Muslim victory in Castile would be a catastrophe for his kingdom as well. He gathered his own army and set off in great haste to join his cousin. The Leonese messengers arrived at the Castilian camp in Alarcos with crucial news. Help was on the way. They only had to wait a few days. The arrival of the Leonese would have balanced the scales. Their army was powerful and experienced. Waiting was the logical option, the prudent one, the militarily correct one. But in Alfonso VIII's war council, prudence was not in fashion. The king gathered his principal nobles to decide the next step, and there the perfect storm of pride and bad counsel broke out. The most influential nobles, led by the king's standard-bearer, Diego López de Haro, were in favor of attacking immediately. They argued that waiting would be a show of cowardice. Worse still, if the Leonese arrived, they would have to share the glory of a victory they considered certain. The idea of their hated Leonese cousin taking part of the credit was, for them, intolerable. They are said to have exclaimed that it was better to die with honor than to live with dishonor. Alfonso VIII, whose character already tended toward arrogance, heard the words he wanted to hear. The idea of achieving a crushing victory alone was too tempting. He wanted to prove to everyone, and especially to his cousin, that he was the leader of Christendom. He rejected the advice of the most veteran members, who urged caution. The decision was made. They would attack at dawn, alone. It was the mistake that sealed his fate. The night of July 18, 1195 was a night of steel and prayers. The two armies camped in sight of one another, separated by a small hill that would witness the drama. The campfires of both camps dotted the darkness like fallen stars, thousands of points of light on a plain that would soon be stained red. The metallic sound of the armorers, sharpening swords and adjusting armor, mingled with the prayers of the soldiers. In the Castilian camp, the atmosphere was one of almost arrogant confidence. The knights spent the night confessing, hearing mass, and preparing for glory. Their battle plan was as simple as it was brutal, the same one that had given them victory so many times. It consisted of a massive frontal charge of their heavy cavalry, a wall of steel and fury designed to overwhelm the center of the Almohad army, kill the Caliph, and cause a general rout. There was no plan B. It was an all-or-nothing bet on a single blow. On the other side of the hill, Yaqub al-Mansur did not rely on faith alone. He relied on strategy. He spent the night touring his lines, rallying his men, and finalizing a much more sophisticated plan. He knew he could not stop the Castilian charge head-on, so he decided to absorb it. His plan consisted of placing his lightest troops in the center, with the order to give ground, to retreat in an orderly fashion, luring the Christians into a trap. Meanwhile, on the flanks, he hid his best cavalry. Their mission was to wait until the Castilians had advanced deep enough to then close the wings like a pincer and surround them completely. And as if that were not enough, he kept an enormous reserve hidden behind the hill, with himself and his fearsome black guard at the head. It was a death trap, perfectly designed to nullify the main strength of his enemy. With the first light of July 19th, 1195, the Castilian army took up formation. The tense silence of the dawn was broken by the sound of trumpets and war horns. In the vanguard, forming a steel wedge, was the elite of the heavy cavalry. It was under the command of the impetuous Diego López de Haro. At his signal, thousands of horses began to move. First at a walk, then at a trot, and finally at a full gallop. The earth trembled. The charge of the Castilian cavalry was a terrifying and magnificent spectacle. It was a tsunami of armored men and beasts, with lances couched, advancing at an unstoppable speed. Its objective was the center of the Almohad army, where the Caliph's standard waved. The enemy archers unleashed clouds of arrows, but many bounced off the shields and armor. The impact was brutal. The first Almohad line, made up of volunteers and light troops, was shattered. The Castilian knights broke through it, sowing death and chaos in their wake. They broke the second line, and then the third. From the rearguard, where Alfonso VIII waited, the battle seemed won. The Almohad vanguard was fleeing in disarray. The knights of López de Haro, drunk on success, threw themselves into the pursuit. They believed they were pursuing a broken army, that victory was a matter of minutes. But they were not winning. They were falling, step by step, and gallop by gallop, right into the center of the deadly trap that Al-Mansur had prepared for them. A small aside, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The Castilian vanguard, led by Diego López de Haro, had charged for almost 1 kilometer. Their horses were exhausted, and the perfect wedge formation had broken down into a disordered mass of men pursuing an enemy in apparent flight. It was then that the Almohad drums sounded. It was not a signal of retreat. It was the signal to close the trap. The flight of the front lines had not been a defeat, but a feigned retreat maneuver, a classic tactic of Eastern warfare. Suddenly, from the flanks of the battlefield, where they had remained hidden, thousands of horsemen emerged. On the right, the very swift Berber light cavalry. On the left, the deadly horse archers of Turkish origin. They did not charge head-on. They moved like swarms, surrounding the disorganized Castilian cavalry, launching a ceaseless rain of arrows and javelins, and retreating before they could respond. In a matter of minutes, the situation changed completely. The vanguard of López de Haro was left completely isolated from the rest of Alfonso VIII's army. The heavy knights, designed for the frontal charge, were clumsy and vulnerable in this type of combat. Their large horses, exhausted, were easy targets. The Christians found themselves trapped in a whirlwind of attacks from all sides, unable to charge, unable to flee. From their position in the rearguard, Alfonso VIII and his men watched in horror as their acclaimed vanguard was swallowed up. The plan, so simple and so proven, had crumbled. Disarray took hold of the Castilian ranks. The euphoria of victory transformed into a chilling sense of panic, and the worst for them was yet to come. While the Castilian vanguard was being massacred, Alfonso VIII committed his final error. Desperate, he ordered the rest of his army to advance to attempt an impossible rescue. But the movement, disorganized and desperate, exposed its own flank. It was the moment that Yaqub al-Mansur had been waiting for. The Caliph gave the order, and his elite reserve entered combat. It was the killing blow. At the head of them all was al-Mansur himself, surrounded by his fearsome black guard. Thousands of the empire's best and most fanatical warriors, fresh and ready for the fight, charged downhill in a devastating charge. The clash was apocalyptic. The main body of the Castilian army, already demoralized, took the full impact. The infantry of the municipal militias, outnumbered, disintegrated in minutes. The knights of the second line tried to resist, but were swept away by the tide of fresh warriors. The battle turned into a slaughter. The center of the battlefield was a hell of steel, screams, and blood. There the combat was no longer tactical, but a brutal struggle for survival. The cohesion of the Christian army completely evaporated. Their lines broke and communication between units disappeared. Panic began to spread like wildfire. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It was an absolute certainty. In the midst of the chaos and the massacre, Alfonso VIII saw his royal standard fall to the ground. It was the unmistakable symbol of total defeat. The king, who had dreamed of a glorious victory, suddenly found himself fighting for his life, surrounded by enemies. His closest nobles, seeing that all was lost, made the only possible decision: save the king to save the kingdom. A dead king meant the collapse of Castile. What followed was a desperate and humiliating flight. The personal guard of Alfonso VIII formed a human shield around him. They were a handful of the best and most loyal knights of the kingdom. Their last mission was not to fight to win, but to die so that the king could escape. One by one they sacrificed themselves, placing themselves in the path of the Almohad cavalry that was seeking the monarch. Thanks to their sacrifice, Alfonso VIII and a small group of survivors managed to break through the inferno and gallop northward. They did not stop until they reached the relative safety of the walls of Toledo. The journey must have been a nightmare. Each gallop of his horse was an echo of his failure. The warrior king, the supposed leader of Christendom, was fleeing like a fugitive, leaving behind thousands of his men dead or about to die. The arrival in Toledo was not a relief, but the confirmation of the catastrophe. The army of Castile, the most powerful military force in Christian Hispania, had ceased to exist in a single afternoon. For Alfonso VIII, the wound was not only military, it was deeply personal. His pride, the force that had driven him his entire life, had been shattered to pieces on the plains of Alarcos. While the king fled, a last pocket of resistance remained on the battlefield. Diego López de Haro, the man whose impetuous charge had initiated the disaster, managed to gather the survivors of the vanguard. With him were the masters of the orders of Santiago and Calatrava, and a handful of nobles. Seeing the battle was lost, they made the only honorable decision left to them: to retreat to the nearby castle of Alarcos and defend it to the death. They managed to reach the fortress and close its gates just in time as the Almohad army flooded the plain. But their situation was desperate. They were few, they were wounded, exhausted, and without any hope of receiving aid. The siege did not last long. The Almohads surrounded the castle and began to prepare the assault machines. The fall of the fortress was a matter of hours. Al-Mansur, however, was a pragmatist. He knew that assaulting the castle would cost him more lives of his own men, and the nobles trapped inside were much more valuable alive than dead. Through a negotiator, the Caliph offered surprisingly generous terms of surrender. He would allow the surviving knights to leave the castle and go free, in exchange for handing over the fortress and a hefty ransom for the most important nobles. For López de Haro and the masters, there was no other option. To accept was a humiliation, but to refuse was a useless suicide. They surrendered their swords and the castle of Alarcos. The capture of so many military leaders of Castile was the final and bitter seal on the catastrophe. The Castilian army had not only been defeated, it had been decapitated. For Yaqub al-Mansur, the field of Alarcos was not a cemetery. It was a promise, the promise that Castile was broken, open, and at his mercy. With the enemy army annihilated, the question was not if he would attack, but where and how. Many expected a direct march on Toledo, the jewel in the crown. But the Caliph was a strategist, not a gambler. He knew that Toledo was a formidable fortress. A long and costly siege would have given the other Christian kingdoms time to react. His objective was not a risky conquest, but a systematic campaign of punishment. So instead of going north, he moved like a predator. With the border defenseless, his army divided into riding columns. First fell the castle of Calatrava, the heart of the military order massacred in the battle. Then his advance was relentless. One column ravaged the Tagus Valley. The strongholds of Guadalajara, Madrid, and Alcalá fell. Another headed west, eventually taking Salamanca. Each conquered castle, each sacked town, was another hammer blow on the coffin of Castilian pride. Thousands of captives were sent south as slaves. This campaign was not just military, it was a message. Al-Mansur was demonstrating that he could strike wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He did not seek to annex territory permanently. He sought to humiliate Alfonso VIII to the core. He wanted every corner of Castile to feel the price of having challenged him. The victory at Alarcos did not quench Yaqub al-Mansur's thirst. It only opened it. The Caliph had no intention of returning to Africa with a simple trophy. He wanted all of Castile to pay for the audacity of its king. The year 1196 became the year of terror. The strategy was not to conquer, it was to annihilate. The Caliph unleashed a series of devastating raids on the frontier, the so-called asifas. They were not armies of occupation. They were plagues of human locusts, designed to burn crops, destroy villages, and take everything of value, including people. With the military orders shattered, there was no one to stand against them. Fortresses that had resisted for decades, such as Montanches or Trujillo, fell in a matter of days. Their defenders were put to the sword and their walls torn down. Every castle that burned was a beacon of Castilian impotence. The culminating point of this campaign of punishment came when the Almohad troops appeared outside Toledo. They did not attempt a formal siege. They did not need to. It was a demonstration of power, a supreme act of humiliation. The Caliph was showing Alfonso VIII that he could reach his doorstep whenever he wished. While the Almohad banner waved in sight of the walls, other columns plundered the entire region. They reached Madrid, then a small fortified town, and devastated it. They burned the fields of Alcalá and Guadalajara. Castile could not defend itself. It could only watch from the top of its walls as its kingdom bled out and burned. With his kingdom in flames and without an army, Alfonso VIII had to do the unthinkable. The king who dreamed of being emperor was forced to swallow his pride. He sent emissaries to ask for peace from Yaqub al-Mansur. It was no longer a matter of winning, but of surviving. The negotiations were a total humiliation. The Caliph, in a position of absolute power, dictated the terms with no room for discussion. Castile had to accept a 5-year truce. The price of that peace was very high. The Castilian king ceded all the key fortresses on the border. Castles like Alarcos, the site of the massacre, passed into Almohad hands. Calatrava was also surrendered, the heart of the annihilated military order. In practice, Alfonso VIII was handing over the keys to his own kingdom. This is where the humiliation becomes deeper. Some sources suggest that the treaty included the payment of parias. What were the parias? It was a tribute, an annual payment to buy peace. The great Christian king, paying a sum of gold to the Caliph so that he would not attack him. Whether it was true or not, the damage to his reputation was irreparable. The news spread like wildfire throughout all of Christendom. Alfonso VIII, the supposed champion of the faith, had been crushed. Now he knelt diplomatically before his victor. The king's pride was reduced to ashes. But in those ashes, a slow and dangerous fire began to burn. It was the desire for vengeance. While Castile licked its wounds, in Al-Andalus, euphoria broke out. The news of the victory reached Seville, and the city erupted in celebrations that lasted for days. The mosques filled with the faithful to give thanks to God. The court poets composed epic verses that praised the genius of the Caliph. For Yaqub, the victory of Alarcos was the confirmation of his destiny. It was then that he formally adopted the title by which he would go down in history, Al-Mansur Billah, the victorious by the grace of God. It was not a nickname, it was a declaration of power, a message for the entire Islamic world that he was the chosen champion to defend the faith. His return to Marrakesh, the capital of the empire, was a triumphal spectacle. He paraded through the streets hailed as a hero, presenting the captured Castilian banners as trophies. The victory consolidated his authority in a way that no campaign in Africa had achieved. He had humiliated the most feared enemy. But Al-Mansur did not rest on the laurels of propaganda. He used the peace he had imposed to strengthen his position. He ordered the reconstruction and reinforcement of the entire line of castles that he had seized from Castile. Alarcos and Calatrava became the anchors of an almost impregnable Almohad defensive wall. During a brief but intense period, the Almohad power on the peninsula was absolute. They had no rival. From the Atlas Mountains to the Tagus River, everything was under their control. Alarcos was not just a battle won. It was the coronation of an empire at its moment of maximum splendor. The news of the catastrophe of Alarcos crossed the Pyrenees and reached Rome. There, in the Lateran Palace, an elderly pope named Celestine III understood the true magnitude of the disaster. That was not a simple border defeat. It was an existential threat to all of Christendom. The Pope acted with the forcefulness that the situation required. For the first time, he began to preach with insistence the need for an authentic crusade on the Iberian Peninsula. He made a call to all the princes of Europe. He asked them to send men and money to help the Hispanic kingdoms. This papal message had an unexpected effect, especially on the neighbors of Castile. Alfonso IX of Leon and Sancho VII of Navarre, who had watched their rivals' humiliation with a certain satisfaction, began to feel a cold sweat. They had played at weakening Castile, but the result was an Almohad power stronger than ever. The question that ran through the courts of Leon and Pamplona was very simple: who would be next? They understood that the fall of Castile would not benefit them. On the contrary, it would leave them alone and unprotected, facing an unstoppable enemy. Fear turned out to be a much more effective counselor than pride. The defeat of Alarcos, therefore, became a bitter but necessary lesson. It demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that internal divisions were suicide. The humiliating truce, signed by Alfonso VIII, gave him time. But not only for him to rebuild his army, it gave time to all of Christendom to awaken and to begin to gestate, very slowly, the response that would change history. The signed truce did not bring peace to the soul of Alfonso VIII. It was the starting gun for the longest and most meticulous revenge of the Reconquista. During the following 17 years, every decision of his reign had a single objective: to meet the Almohads again and crush them. The king learned the hard way that pride and fury did not win battles. So, he dedicated himself to transforming his army. Heavy cavalry would no longer be the only answer. He promoted the massive use of crossbowmen and archers. Above all, he imposed an iron discipline. The impetuous and disorganized charges were over. But the real change was internal. The monarch who had scorned the help of his cousins had to learn to be a patient diplomat. Little by little, he was weaving alliances, resolving border disputes with Leon and Navarre. He surely had to swallow his pride on more than one occasion, but he knew that he could never again afford to fight alone. His diplomatic masterpiece came from Rome. Pope Innocent III, much more energetic than his predecessor, understood the Almohad threat. After years of pleas and negotiations, Alfonso obtained what he was seeking: a papal bull for a crusade. This turned his war of vengeance into a holy war for all of Christendom, a call to which the knights of all Europe could not resist. For almost 2 decades, Castile prepared in silence. The memory of the humiliation of Alarcos was kept alive, not as a wound, but as fuel. The arrogant king of 1195 had died on that plain. In his place rose a cold and patient strategist who was only waiting for the right moment. And that moment was about to arrive. 17 years. That was the time revenge waited, simmering in the memory of a king and a kingdom. In 1212, in a place called Las Navas de Tolosa, History offered Alfonso VIII a second chance, and this time he did not waste it. The army that gathered at the foot of the Sierra Morena was the antithesis of the one at Alarcos. Castile was no longer alone. Riding at its side were the King of Aragon, Pedro II, and the King of Navarre, Sancho VII. Thousands of crusaders from all over Europe had answered the Pope's call. Unity, scorned in 1195, was now their greatest strength. The battle was the inverse reflection of Alarcos. Alfonso VIII had learned his lesson in the most brutal way possible. There were no blind and arrogant cavalry charges. The Christian advance was disciplined and coordinated. The infantry withstood the first Almohad onslaught, and the cavalry charged only at the right moment, decisively breaking the enemy lines. Whereas at Alarcos, the Almohad flanks surrounded the Christians. At Las Navas, it was the Christians who flanked and crushed the army of the new Caliph. The trap, this time, was set by the one who had been hunted. The victory was total, crushing. The consequences were definitive. The defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa marked the beginning of the end for the Almohad Empire. Their military power on the peninsula was shattered forever. The Reconquista, which at Alarcos had been on the verge of dying, received an unstoppable momentum that would only end in Granada. Therefore, Alarcos cannot be remembered only as a defeat. It was the most expensive and painful lesson in the history of Spain, a catastrophe that forced a king to abandon his pride. It was the necessary failure that forged the unity and strategy for the most important victory of all. The glory of Las Navas de Tolosa was built on the bones and humiliation of Alarcos. And so we come to the end of our journey. The story of Alarcos is a brutal reminder of how pride can lead to disaster. But it also teaches us a more powerful lesson. Sometimes, the most humiliating defeat is the seed of the greatest victory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the key moments of our history. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications. That way you won't miss our next adventures through the past.